Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Simone de Beauvoir begins the third part of her work, The Ethics of Ambiguity, with a section titled The Aesthetic Attitude, which might lead you right off the bat to think about beauty and artwork. And there is some connection to that, both in terms of appreciating it and in terms of producing it. But it's broader as well, and it emerges out of a sort of problematic that stems from what she calls objections that get posed to the existentialist ethics doctrine she's been developing. So she begins this by saying every person has to do with other people. The world in which one engages oneself is a human world in which each object is penetrated with human meanings. It's a speaking world from which solicitations and appeals rise up. So through this world of other people, each individual can give their freedom a concrete content. We have to disclose the world with the purpose of further disclosure, and by the same movement try to free other human beings by means of which the world takes on meaning. So this is the doctrine that she has been developing in the earlier parts and is going to keep redeveloping throughout the work. So one might say, well, I don't know about that. First of all, there is a problem in what you're saying. What are you talking about, willing yourself free? If you're already free, if that's part of human nature, the human condition, that you are a free, whatever, subject, thing, human being, you can't will yourself free. You're already free. And the existentialist position on this is to think about the nature of freedom. You are so free that you don't have it all at once. But we'll come back to that later. She also says, somebody might come along and say, well, you can't actually will anything for another person. If you're radically free, they're radically free as well. And, the use of your freedom doesn't contribute in any way or hinder in any way their freedom, which is a common dodge, we could say. And then the third objection is basically that, we're always disclosing being, she says, in Buchenwald, a death camp, as well as in the Blue Isles of the Pacific, and hovels as well as palaces. Something's always happening in the world and in the movement of keeping being at a distance. Can one not consider its different transformations with a detached joy or find reasons for acting? No solution is better or worse than another. So there's no criteria by which one can actually choose what to do with one's freedom. So this leads to what she calls the aesthetic attitude. And what does that mean? She says we can call it aesthetic because the one who adopts it claims to have no other relationship with the world than that of detached contemplation. Outside of time, far from human beings, they face history which they think they don't belong to, like a pure beholding. So aesthetic in the sense of looking on, perceiving, perhaps even judging and responding to, but not feeling engaged with. It apprehends all of the situations only in the indifference of their differences. It excludes any preference. And she's going to give you some examples. The lover of historical works is present at the birth and the downfall of Athens, Rome, and Byzantium with the same serene passion. The tourist considers the arena of the Colosseum, the latifundia of Syracuse, the thermal baths, the palaces, the temples, the prisons, and the churches with the same tranquil curiosity. These things existed that is enough to satisfy him. You might think about people here in the United States who want to see the Liberty Bell and then go to Gettysburg. And then, it's all about just sort of being there and looking on. And it's not as if that's totally bad or there's nothing productive about it. But if that's all you're doing is just kind of looking on as if everything is a museum, that is the aesthetic attitude. She says, we find this temptation among many Italians who are weighed down by a magical and deceptive past. The present already seems to them like a future past. Wars, civil disputes, invasions, and slavery have succeeded one another in their land, right? One might imagine an intellectual Florentine being skeptical about the great uncertain movements which are stirring up his country and which will die out as did the seethings of the centuries which have gone by. What is the important thing? To understand the temporary events and through them to cultivate the beauty which perishes not. She doesn't let French people off the hook, and she's writing this shortly after World War II and the Nazi occupation. Many Frenchmen sought relief in this thought in 1940, the downfall of France, and then the years that followed. Let's try to take the point of the view of history, they said, learning that the Germans had entered Paris, right? And she says, such an attitude appears in moments of discourage and confusion, but there's something more going on there. It is, as she calls it, a position of withdrawal. So it is taking a position. It's not just neutral, right? It's actively withdrawing, a way of fleeing what she calls the truth of the present. She says, as concerns the past, this eclecticism is legitimate. We're no longer in a live situation in regard to Athens, Sparta, or Alexandria. To pretend otherwise is kind of silly, right? And you think about the people today who are like, I would be a Viking. I would be a Roman centurion. No, buddy, you'd probably be a slave. And, frankly, you'd have died young. And you can't lose yourself in these imaginary pasts that aren't even close to the history of it. She says, the present is not a potential past. It is the moment of choice and action. So taking up a position of withdrawal is fleeing from that. It's pretending to a being above it all, a non-commitment. That's essentially a lie about oneself. And she talks about to put oneself outside is still a way of living the inescapable fact that one is inside. One cannot justify all that is by asserting that everything may equally be the object of contemplation because the human being never contemplates. They do. No, that's a little bit too far. They do contemplate, and contemplation is also an action, but we have to be committed in certain ways. And so she's going to go on and say this is even bigger of a problem for the artist and the writer. And that's her. She is among them. She didn't do fine arts as such, but she is a writer not just of philosophy, but of plays, of memoirs, of novels, so short stories as well, and all sorts of other things, essays. So the problem for the artist and the writer, she's going to say, is raised in a acute, so that means it's intensified, and equivocal manner. Equivocal means it has multiple meanings that might be confused with each other. So the artist and writer are not just passively contemplating, they are actively working on some sort of definite project. It could be a sculpture, it could be a novel, it could be a symphony, whatever it's going to be, right? She says they project toward the work of art a subject which they justify insofar as it's the matter of this work. Any subject could be justified or admitted, a massacre as well as a masquerade. And she notes that there's a problem that can arise out of this. So let's say you're a committed author. You're going to write about the poor and how they've been oppressed in situations as workers in a company town or something like that. She says that A writer wants to communicate the horror inspired in him by children working in sweatshops. He produces so beautiful a work that, enchanted by the tale, the style, and the images, we forget the horror of the sweatshops or even start admiring it. Will we not then be inclined to think that if death, misery, and injustice can be transfigured for our delight, it is not an evil for there to be death, misery, and injustice? We turn what's happening to other people, real people, into something that's an aesthetic spectacle for ourselves. I'm reminded at this point of something that a number of veterans have said about supposedly realistic war movies that have come out in recent years. For example, World War II veterans talking about, Saving Private Ryan or things that are very graphic, right? What do they typically say? Oh, no, man, things were so much worse than the movie that you're seeing. If they actually showed you what real war was like, you would be disgusted and find yourself turning away from it, right? And what we have instead is an aesthetization, even when there's a memorialization of the actuality that happened. Similarly with stories about terrible oppression and exploitation that has taken place. We're always leaving a lot of it out. And there's a possibility of what she's calling aesthetic justification. So that's, something that an artist and writer have to be attuned to. She also talks about the present and the past and says we have to avoid confusing the present with the past. The past is past. There's no further action possible in the past because it's gone. She says the executioner became an executioner. The victim underwent his fate as a victim without us. That doesn't mean that we're purely passive. She says all we can do is reveal it, to integrate it into the human heritage, to raise it to the dignity of the aesthetic existence, which bears in itself its finality. But first, this history had to occur, and we were only able to try to save it because it first offered us a form, something that we could wrap our heads around, right? So it's not as if we have to adopt a purely passive contemplative attitude towards the past. Oh, the past is past. We can't do anything about it. We do have some options that do seem quite active, but they don't change the past. All they do is bring it out. What about the present? As she says, the present exists as an engagement and commitment. There's where we can actually do something. She says, if we considered the world as object to be manifested, if we thought it was saved by this destination in such a way that everything about it already seemed justified and there was no more of it to reject, there'd be nothing more to say about it. It's revealed through rejection, desire, hate, and love, through our passionate commitments in the world. In order for the artist to have a world to express, they must be situated in this world, not just standing apart from it, oppressed or oppressing, resigned or rebellious, a human among humans. But at the heart of their existence, they find the exigence, the demand, which is common to all human beings. They must will freedom within themselves, and universally, they must try to conquer it. So this tells us how, to perhaps get past the aesthetic attitude and not allow it to become a trap, which is a trap that people fall into through the very use of their freedom as human beings.